Have you ever been told you can't visit your own parents? Not by them, mind you, but by some self-appointed neighborhood monarch with a clipboard and a truly breathtaking sense of entitlement. Well, strap yourselves in because I have, and it launched a saga so bizarre, so utterly infuriating, that it culminated in my father, a man whose patience is usually measured in geological time, effectively getting this entire homeowners association banned from operating anywhere in our county. Drop a comment below if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA that made you question the very fabric of civilization, and definitely let me know where you're watching from, because this story is a wild ride, and you're going to want to compare notes. This isn't just a story about a petty tyrant. It's about how one overreach too many can unravel an entire fiefdom built on flimsy bylaws and an even flimsier grasp of actual law. It all started, as these things often do, with my parents deciding to downsize. They'd found this rather charming little house in a newer subdivision called Creekide Meadows, which, despite its bucolic name, was pretty standard suburban fare. Neat lawns, matching mailboxes, the whole 9 yards. It wasn't advertised as a 55-plus community, not on any of the listings, not by the realtor, not in any of the paperwork Mom meticulously reviewed. My parents, both in their early 60s but spry and active, were looking for a quieter life, not necessarily an age-segregated one. The house was perfect, a single-story ranch with a manageable garden, and they were thrilled. I was thrilled for them. I live about an hour away, and the new place was actually a bit closer, making impromptu visits for dinner or just a coffee that much easier, or so I thought. The first few months were idyllic. They settled in, met a few of the neighbors who seemed perfectly pleasant, and started enjoying their new, lower-maintenance lifestyle. I visited a couple of times, helped hang some pictures, programmed their new smart TV, typical dutiful son stuff. No black helicopters, no warning sirens, no sense that we were on the verge of suburban warfare. Then came the infamous welcome packet incident. About 3 months after they moved in, a thick manila envelope was unceremoniously wedged into their mail slot, addressed simply to the new residents. Inside was a veritable encyclopedia of rules and regulations, the HOA covenant for Creekside Meadows, along with a rather imperious welcome letter from the HOA president, a Ms. Agnes Periwinkle. My mother, bless her heart, actually tried to read it. She called me later that evening, her voice a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. "Honey," she said, "you won't believe this. Apparently we need approval to change the color of our welcome mat. And there's a whole page on acceptable lawn gnome placement." We chuckled about it. Standard HOA overreach, we figured, mostly ignorable, as long as you kept your grass trimmed and didn't paint your house purple. The welcome letter itself was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive condescension, hinting that adherence to the community standards was paramount for maintaining our property values and a harmonious living environment. It was signed, with a flourish that suggested delusions of grandeur, Agnes Periwinkle, President, Creekside Meadows HOA. I pictured a woman with a tightly permed hairdo, a crisply ironed blouse, and eyes that could spot an unapproved petunia from 50 paces. I wasn't far off, as it turned out. The real trouble began a few weeks later. I'd arranged to drive over on a Saturday morning to help Dad with a minor plumbing issue, a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom that was proving more stubborn than anticipated. I'm an engineer by trade, fairly handy with tools, and these little father-son projects were something we both enjoyed. I pulled up to their house around 10, parked in their driveway, and was just getting my small toolbox out of the trunk when a woman emerged from the house directly across the street. She was, shall we say, a vision. Think Margaret Thatcher, but with more hairspray and an expression that suggested she'd just found a slug in her Earl Grey. Her gaze, sharp and critical, swept over me, my decidedly non-luxury sedan, and lingered on the toolbox. This, I would soon learn, was Agnes Periwinkle in the flesh. She marched across the street with the determined gait of a drill sergeant, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "May I help you?" she inquired, her voice several degrees colder than the pleasant spring morning. It wasn't an offer of assistance, it was a demand for justification of my presence. Before I could even formulate a polite reply, my dad came out the front door, wiping his hands on a rag. "Oh, Agnes," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Good morning. This is my son, Michael. He's just come to give me a hand with a leaky tap." Agnes Periwinkle's eyes narrowed, flicking between me and my father. "Your son?" she repeated, as if the concept were foreign and vaguely suspicious. "He doesn't live here." It was a statement, not a question. "No, he doesn't," Dad confirmed. "He's visiting." Agnes consulted her clipboard, flipping a page with an air of grave importance. "Well," she announced, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the paper, "according to Article 7, Section B, Subsection 4 of the Creekide Meadows Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, this is a designated 55 and older community. All permanent residents must meet the age requirement, and while short-term visitation by non-qualifying individuals is permitted, extended stays, or frequent visitations that emulate residency by individuals under the age of 55, are strictly monitored to maintain the character and legal status of our community." I blinked. My dad looked momentarily stunned. "Agnes," he said slowly, "my son is here for a few hours to fix a faucet. That's hardly an extended stay." She gave a tight, unsympathetic smile. "The rules are the rules, Mr. Henderson. We've had issues in the past. We must be vigilant." She then turned her steely gaze back to me. "And for future reference, all contractor vehicles," she said, her voice dripping with disdain as she eyed my toolbox again, "should be parked on the street, not in driveways, to maintain aesthetic uniformity." I was, at this point, speechless. I wasn't a contractor. I was family. And the idea that fixing my parents' faucet was somehow a threat to the character and legal status of Creekide Meadows was patently absurd. My dad, a retired judge and a man not easily flustered, managed a tight, "Thank you for the clarification, Agnes. Michael will be gone this afternoon." She gave a curt nod. "See that he is. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." With that, she pivoted and marched back to her own personal command center, leaving a palpable chill in the air. My dad and I exchanged a look of sheer disbelief. "What in the Sam Hill was that?" I finally asked. Dad shook his head, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "That, son, was Agnes Periwinkle, the self-appointed guardian of Creekide Meadows. And apparently, she thinks you're trying to move in and lower the collective tone." We went inside, the leaky faucet momentarily forgotten. Mom joined us in the kitchen and Dad recounted the exchange. She was aghast. "A 55 and older community? Nobody ever told us that. It wasn't in any of the sales documents. The realtor specifically said it was open to everyone, just popular with retirees because of the single-story homes." Dad frowned. "I don't recall seeing that designation anywhere either, certainly not emphasized. I'll have to go back through all the paperwork we signed for the house and the HOA documents she dropped off." This was the first inkling that something was seriously amiss, beyond just an overzealous HOA president. The claim that Creekide Meadows was a legally designated 55-plus community was news to all of us. And if it were true, how had they not known? More importantly, how could Agnes Periwinkle take it upon herself to so aggressively police the visitation of a family member? The incident left a sour taste, an undercurrent of unease that settled over what should have been a pleasant weekend chore. Little did I know, this was just the opening salvo in a campaign of escalating absurdity that would push my usually unflappable father to a point I'd rarely seen, and would lead us down a rabbit hole of HOA bylaws, county records, and legal arcana that would eventually blow the lid off Agnes Periwinkle's meticulously curated little kingdom. The fight for my right to visit my own parents had just begun. My dad, being the thorough man he is, spent the next few days meticulously combing through every single piece of paper related to their house purchase and the HOA. He spread documents across the dining room table, the purchase agreement, title reports, the thick CC/R booklet Agnes had delivered, and the original property listing. I called him midweek for an update. "It's ambiguous," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. The original realtor listing says nothing about age restrictions. The purchase agreement is standard. However, buried deep within the HOA's CC rupees, on page 47, in tiny print, there is a clause that states the aspiration of the community is to eventually qualify under the Housing for Older Persons Act, HOPA, and that residents are encouraged to be 55 or older. It doesn't explicitly state it is currently a HOPA-compliant community, nor does it lay out stringent visitation restrictions like Agnes implied. This was a critical distinction. HOPA provides an exemption from the Fair Housing Act's familial status discrimination provisions if certain conditions are met, such as at least 80% of occupied units having at least one resident aged 55 or older, and the community publishing and adhering to policies demonstrating an intent to be housing for persons 55 or older. An aspiration and an encouragement are a far cry from a legally binding, enforceable 55-plus status that would allow them to dictate who visits whom and for how long, especially for brief family visits. So, she's overstating her authority? I asked. Considerably, it seems, Dad replied. But she's clearly latched onto that aspiration and is running with it as if it's gospel, backed by federal law. The problem is, to challenge her interpretation, we'd have to go through the HOA's own grievance procedures, which, I suspect, are presided over by Agnes herself. A classic catch-22. The following weekend, I decided to visit again. Not out of defiance, not yet anyway, but because my mother had invited me for Sunday lunch. I made a point of parking on the street this time, a small, petty concession. But I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to see my parents. I was inside their house for no more than 20 minutes, catching up, when there was a sharp rap at the door. It was Agnes again. This time, however, she wasn't alone. She was flanked by another resident, a nervous-looking man who clutched a notepad and pen. Clearly, her designated minute-taker or, more likely, witness. Agnes's expression was even more severe than before, if that were possible. Her thin lips were pressed into a grim line, and she held a letter in her hand. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, she began, her voice resonating with an unearned authority. I issued a verbal warning last week regarding the visitation policies. It appears that warning was not heeded. My father stepped forward, his posture calm but his eyes like chips of ice. Agnes, my son is here for lunch. He is a guest. He is not residing here. What is the issue? Agnes thrust the letter at him. The issue, Mr. Henderson, is that Creekide Meadows is a community for persons 55 years of age or older. Your son, Michael, she glanced at me with open disapproval, is clearly not 55. His repeated presence here constitutes a violation of the community's established rules and character. This is an official written warning. A copy will be placed in your permanent file. My mother, who had come to the door behind Dad, gasped. A permanent file? For visiting our son? Agnes ignored her. Furthermore, she continued, her voice rising, until such time as your son can provide verifiable proof of being 55 years of age or older, or the HOA board grants a specific, time-limited exemption for compassionate care reasons, which requires extensive documentation, he is no longer permitted on Creekide Meadows property. Any further unauthorized presence will be considered trespassing, and we will be forced to involve law enforcement. This was beyond bullying. This was an outright ban. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. You can't be serious, I exclaimed. You're banning me from visiting my own parents because I'm not old enough? This is a public street. They own this house. Agnes sniffed disdainfully. The streets within Creekide Meadows are private roads, maintained by the HOA for the benefit of our qualified residents. And the covenants you agreed to when purchasing your home give the HOA board the authority to enforce these rules to protect the integrity of our 55 and older status. It's all in the documents, if you'd bothered to read them thoroughly. Her gaze flickered to my father, a subtle challenge. Dad took the letter, his face unreadable. Agnes, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, you are treading on very thin ice. I suggest you and your associate return to your duties. We will review this. Communication. The nervous man beside Agnes visibly gulped. Agnes, however, seemed to puff up with self-importance. "See that you do. The rules are clear, and they will be enforced." She turned, her companion scurrying after her, and marched away, leaving us standing in the doorway, stunned and furious. The aroma of Mom's roast chicken, which had been wafting invitingly from the kitchen, now seemed to mock us. Lunch was officially ruined. My own parents, in their own home, were being told who they could and couldn't have over, all based on a dubious interpretation of a vaguely worded clause by a woman who clearly relished the power she wielded over her neighbors. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was personal. And Agnes Periwinkle had just made a very big mistake. She had no idea who she was dealing with, not just me, but more importantly, my father. The retired judge still had a few gavels left to swing, metaphorically speaking, of course. The official written warning was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. It cited various articles and subsections of the CC rupees, alluding to the community's supposed 55-plus status, as if it were an immutable law of physics. It detailed penalties for non-compliance, including fines, liens on the property, and, as Agnes had so chillingly threatened, involving law enforcement for trespassing. My mother was distraught. "This is insane, Robert," she said to my father, her voice trembling slightly. "She can't actually do this, can she? Ban Michael from our home?" Dad, whose calm demeanor was a hallmark of his decades on the bench, was visibly angry. He reread the letter, his jaw tight. "She thinks she can, Eleanor. And that's the problem. This document is riddled with assumptions and overreaches, but it's designed to scare people into compliance." He looked at me. "Michael, I know this is infuriating, but for now, let's not provoke her further. Don't attempt to visit until we've figured out our next move. The last thing we need is some trumped-up trespassing charge, creating an unnecessary complication." It galled me to no end, but I agreed. The thought of my parents being subjected to daily harassment or fines because of me was unbearable, but the idea of Agnes Periwinkle dictating my family life was even worse. This wasn't just about a visit anymore. It was about principle. Over the next week, Dad and I strategized. He pulled out his old legal textbooks, accessed online legal databases, and made a few discreet calls to former colleagues specializing in property law and HOA disputes. I, in the meantime, took on the role of forensic investigator, digging into Creekide Meadows itself. I started with county records. Was Creekide Meadows officially zoned or registered as a Housing for Older Persons Act community? This was critical. If it wasn't, then Agnes's entire premise was built on sand. The county's online portal was a labyrinth of permits, zoning maps, and planning documents, but I'm persistent. I searched for Creekide Meadows, its developer, and any associated filings related to HOA or 55-plus designations. After hours of sifting through digital paperwork, I found it, or rather the lack of it. There was no official designation, no application, no approval from the county planning department, or any relevant state agency certifying Creekide Meadows as a HOPA-compliant 55-plus community. All I found were the standard subdivision plats and building permits. The aspiration in their CC rupees was just that, a wish, a dream, with no legal teeth at the county or state level. This was interesting, very interesting. Simultaneously, Dad was examining the HOA's incorporation documents, which he'd requested from the Secretary of State's office. "Here's something else," he said during one of our evening calls, a note of triumph in his voice. "Creekide Meadows HOA is registered as a standard non-profit corporation for the purpose of managing common areas. There's no mention in its articles of incorporation about enforcing age restrictions or operating as a de facto 55-plus community. In fact, for it to legally operate as such and enforce those kinds of exclusionary rules, especially regarding familial status, it would need to strictly comply with HOPA's 80-20 rule and maintain meticulous records, including regular age verification surveys of all residents, and provide clear, unambiguous notice of its status to all prospective buyers. That welcome packet from Agnes was the first time your mother and I saw any such claim in writing, and it was hardly unambiguous. He explained further that HOPA compliance isn't just a label an HOA can slap on itself. It requires diligent, ongoing effort and proof. If the HOA couldn't demonstrate that at least 80% of its occupied units were inhabited by at least one person aged 55 or older, and that it had consistent policies and practices in place to verify this and to communicate its status, then its attempts to enforce age-based restrictions, especially against visitors, were likely discriminatory and unlawful under the Fair Housing Act. Agnes isn't just overreaching, Michael. Dad said, she's potentially exposing the HOA to significant legal liability. If they are falsely claiming HOPA status and discriminating based on age without meeting the requirements, they could be in serious trouble. The picture was becoming clearer. Agnes Periwinkle was running Creekide Meadows like her own private club, using a vaguely worded aspiration in the CC, ours as a cudgel to enforce her personal vision of a child-free, or at least under 55-free, utopia, regardless of the actual legal standing or the rights of the homeowners. Her aggressive tactics, the permanent file, the threats of involving law enforcement, it was all designed to intimidate residents into submission. Most people, faced with such an onslaught, would likely back down, assuming the HOA knew what it was doing. But Agnes hadn't counted on the Hendersons. She hadn't counted on a retired judge with an encyclopedic knowledge of the law, and a son with a knack for research and a deep-seated aversion to bullies. We started to gather more evidence. Mom, initially hesitant to make waves, became an invaluable, if discreet, source of intel from within Creekide Meadows. She spoke to a few of the more approachable neighbors, ostensibly making small talk, but gently probing their experiences with the HOA and Agnes. It turned out that many residents were chafing under Agnes's reign. There were stories of absurd fines for trivial infractions, holiday decorations left up a day too long, unapproved garden hose colors, children's laughter deemed excessive. Several neighbors confirmed they had never been formally surveyed for their age, a key HOPA requirement. One couple, who were in their late 40s but had inherited the house from a parent, mentioned they'd received similar veiled warnings about their suitability for the community. Despite owning their property outright, they were too intimidated to challenge Agnes openly. The common thread was fear. Agnes, with her clipboard and her iron will, had created an atmosphere of low-level dread. She and her small coterie of board members, the nervous note-taker from the doorstep encounter, was the HOA secretary, a Mr. Peterson, apparently terrified of Agnes, ran the HOA with minimal transparency and maximum authority. Financial statements were vague, meeting minutes were selectively edited, and any dissent was swiftly quashed. It was a textbook case of a runaway HOA board, drunk on a tiny sliver of power, and the 55-plus claim was her crown jewel, the ultimate tool for exclusion and control. Armed with our research, the lack of county HOPA designation, the deficiencies in the HOA's own corporate filings, and the anecdotal evidence of non-compliance with HOPA operational requirements, Dad began to formulate a plan. It wasn't just about getting my ban lifted anymore. This was bigger. Agnes Periwinkle and her board were, in Dad's carefully chosen legal parlance, operating outside the scope of their legitimate authority and potentially violating state and federal laws. He explained that a strongly worded letter from an attorney might make them pause, but someone like Agnes would likely dig in her heels, viewing it as a challenge to her sovereignty. We need to go beyond that, Dad said, a steely glint in his eye. We need to address the root of the problem, the HOA's misrepresentation of its status and its ultra-vires actions. There are county and state avenues for this. He started talking about things like declaratory judgments, quo warranto proceedings, a legal action requiring a person or corporation to show by what warrant they exercise an office or franchise, and formal complaints to the state attorney general's office for deceptive practices. This was escalating beyond my wildest expectations. My initial frustration over a ridiculous ban was transforming into a kind of grim fascination. We were essentially preparing to legally dismantle Agnes Periwinkle's power base. The smoking gun wasn't a single document, but rather the glaring absence of legitimacy for her central claim. She was a queen ruling a kingdom that only existed in her mind and on shoddily drafted HOA papers, a kingdom whose borders, it turned out, did not align with the actual map of the law. The next step was to craft a formal, undeniable challenge, one that Agnes couldn't simply dismiss with a wave of her imperious hand and another threatening letter. The battle lines were drawn, and we were about to bring a cannon to her knife fight. The strategy Dad outlined was multi-pronged. First, we would compile all our findings into an undeniable dossier. This included the lack of official HOA registration with the county or state, the HOA's own articles of incorporation which made no mention of being a 55-plus entity, sworn affidavits from my parents about the lack of disclosure during their purchase, and potentially statements from other residents about the absence of age verification surveys or similar misrepresentations, though getting these would be tricky given the climate of fear Agnes had cultivated. Second, we would send a formal demand letter, not just to Agnes but to every listed member of the HOA board, outlining these deficiencies and demanding an immediate cessation of all enforcement actions based on the purported 55-plus status, including the rescission of my ban and a public correction issued to the community. This letter would be drafted by a lawyer friend of Dad's, someone with a reputation for being tenacious in HOA disputes. Dad himself couldn't officially act as their legal counsel, given his judicial position, but he could certainly advise and guide. The letter, Dad explained, will give them an opportunity to rectify their errors. If they refuse, or if Agnes tries her usual stonewalling, then we escalate. And the escalation won't be a lawsuit for damages, not initially. It will be a formal complaint to the county commission and possibly the state attorney general's office, petitioning for an investigation into the HOA's potentially fraudulent misrepresentation of its legal status and its ultra-vires actions beyond the powers granted to it by its charter and by law. He pointed out that if an HOA is found to be systematically deceiving residents or operating unlawfully, a county or state authority could, in extreme cases, take steps to dissolve the HOA's current leadership, appoint a receiver, or even revoke its authority to operate within that jurisdiction if its very foundation was proven to be based on deceit or gross mismanagement. This was where the banning them from the county idea, which had seemed like such an outlandish fantasy at the start of this, began to take on a veneer of plausibility. It wouldn't be a judge's arbitrary decree, but a consequence of their own profound, systemic wrongdoing. The lawyer Dad engaged, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright, was perfect. She listened to our story, reviewed the initial evidence Dad and I had compiled, and her eyes lit up with a familiar legal battle gleam. "Oh, this is rich," she said, a small smile playing on her lips after Dad detailed Agnes's doorstep pronouncements. Classic overreach. They get a little taste of power, and suddenly they think they're running a sovereign nation. The lack of HOA registration is key. If they haven't properly established themselves under federal and state guidelines, their enforcement of age-based restrictions is almost certainly a Fair Housing Act violation. Albright drafted a letter that was a masterpiece of polite yet unyielding legal force. It meticulously laid out the facts, cited relevant statutes and case law, and clearly stated the actions required of the HOA board. Cease and desist all age-based visit restrictions, retract my ban in writing, and issue a clarification to all residents regarding the true legal status, or lack thereof, of Creekide Meadows as a 55-plus community. It gave them 14 days to comply. The letter was sent via certified mail, return receipt requested, to Agnes Periwinkle and each of the other 4 board members at their home addresses. We knew Agnes would receive hers. We could almost picture her reaction, the tightening of the lips, the indignant snort, the immediate conviction that this was an affront to her authority. The 14 days that followed were quiet. too quiet. My parents reported no further direct harassment, but the atmosphere in Creekide Meadows remained tense. Agnes was seen conferring frequently with her board secretary, Mr. Peterson, both looking increasingly grim. We waited. Would they consult a lawyer? Would they see reason? Or would Agnes's ego prevent any form of retreat? On the 15th day, a letter arrived at Miss Albright's office. It was not from an attorney representing the HOA. It was from Agnes Periwinkle herself, on HOA letterhead, and it was a masterclass in deflection and arrogance. She dismissed Ms. Albright's concerns as misinformed and an attempt to intimidate the board. She reiterated that the CCRs clearly state the community's intention to be 55 plus, and that the board was acting in good faith to uphold those intentions. She accused my parents of failing to integrate, and me of disrupting the peace and quiet expected by our senior residents. As for my ban, it stood. She even had the audacity to suggest that if we pursued this further, the HOA would vigorously defend its rights and seek all available remedies, including legal fees. Ms. Albright read it to us over the phone, her voice dripping with dry amusement. "Well," she said, "she's certainly consistent and remarkably foolish." Dad, however, was not amused. His expression hardened. "All right," he said quietly. "She's chosen her path. Now we choose ours." Agnes Periwinkle had called our bluff, or what she perceived to be a bluff. She had no idea that she wasn't just swatting away a disgruntled resident. She was waving a red flag at a bull who happened to have an intimate understanding of the legal china shop she was rampaging through. Her arrogant dismissal was precisely the ammunition we needed for the next, much more serious phase. The gloves were officially off. Agnes had doubled down on her flimsy authority, and in doing so, had given us the perfect pretext to escalate this to a level she clearly couldn't comprehend. She thought she was defending her little kingdom. She was actually signing its death warrant. The next stop was the county. The formal complaint to the county commission was a meticulously prepared document. Miss Albright, with Dad's extensive input on procedural nuances and local government workings, crafted a petition that was less about my personal grievance, though it was the catalyst, and more about the systemic issues with the Creekide Meadows HOA. It detailed 1. The HOA's consistent misrepresentation of Creekide Meadows as a HOPA-compliant 55-plus community, despite no official registration or certification with county or state authorities. 2. The failure to adhere to HOPA's operational requirements, such as regular age verification surveys and proper disclosure to all buyers. 3. The ultra-vires enforcement of rules, like my visitor ban, based on this misrepresented status, likely constituting discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. 4. A pattern of intimidation and opaque governance by the current HOA board, particularly its president, Agnes Periwinkle, creating a hostile environment for residents who questioned their authority. 5. The potential financial irregularities if HOA funds were being used to defend these unlawful practices, or if fines were being improperly levied. This was more speculative at this stage, but worth including as an area for investigation. The petition requested the county commission to launch a formal investigation into the Creekide Meadows HOA's legal standing, its compliance with state and county laws governing HOAs and nonprofit corporations, and its adherence to fair housing practices. It also requested, as an interim measure, an injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing any age-based restrictions until its legal status was clarified. Crucially, it pointed out that if the HOA was found to be fundamentally misrepresenting itself or operating outside its legal charter in a way that harmed residents or violated public policy, the county might have grounds to seek remedies up to and including the revocation of any county-level recognitions or permits that enabled its operation, or to petition a court for its dissolution or the appointment of a neutral third-party administrator. This was the banned from the county part, framed in careful legalese. It wasn't about exiling Agnes. It was about stripping her illegitimate power structure. Copies of all our evidence were attached. The property listings, the CCRs, with the flimsy aspiration clause, the county record search, showing no hope of filing, Agnes's threatening letters, her defiant response to Ms. Albright, and a sworn affidavit from my father detailing his observations and the misleading information provided, or omitted, at the time of purchase. Ms. Albright also managed to get a discreet, anonymized statement from one other resident who had been pressured about their age, which added a little more weight. The petition was filed with the county clerk, and courtesy copies were sent, again via certified mail, to Agnes and her board. This time, we imagined the reaction would be less smug dismissal and more a dawning sense of panic, or at least one could hope. The county commission, a normally sleepy body that dealt with zoning variances and budget approvals, took this rather seriously. An HOA effectively thumbing its nose at fair housing laws and potentially defrauding its residents by misrepresenting its nature was not something they encountered every day. The fact that the complaint was so thoroughly documented and professionally presented by a reputable law firm likely helped. They scheduled a preliminary hearing. Agnes Periwinkle and the Creekide Meadows HOA board were formally summoned to appear. Suddenly, Agnes wasn't just dealing with a disgruntled family. She was facing the official scrutiny of the county government. My parents, Dad in particular, were stoic but resolute. Mom was anxious, hoping this would all be over soon. I was a bundle of nervous energy and righteous anticipation. We knew Agnes would fight. Her entire identity seemed wrapped up in her role as the supreme ruler of Creekide Meadows. The idea of her admitting fault was laughable. We anticipated bluster, denial, and perhaps even an attempt to paint herself as the victim, a dedicated community leader besieged by troublemakers. Ms. Albright prepped us. Let her talk, she advised. The more rope she takes, the better for us. The day of the hearing arrived. The county commission chamber was a fairly unimpressive room, wood-paneled and smelling faintly of floor wax and old coffee. A handful of other Creekide Meadows residents were there, looking apprehensive but curious. Word had clearly gotten out. Agnes Periwinkle arrived with Mr. Peterson, her trembling secretary, in tow. She was dressed in what she probably considered her power suit, a severe navy blue ensemble, and carried a bulging briefcase, presumably filled with her version of evidence. She did not, however, have an attorney with her. A critical error, but entirely in character. She likely believed she could handle this herself, that her force of personality and her ironclad belief in her own righteousness would prevail. The commission chair, a no-nonsense older gentleman named Mr. Davies, called the matter of Creekide Meadows HOA. Ms. Albright presented our case calmly and methodically, summarizing the key points of the petition and highlighting the lack of legal basis for the HOA's 55-plus claims and enforcement actions. She emphasized the harm caused not just to my family, but potentially to all residents living under a regime of misrepresentation. Then it was Agnes's turn. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and launched into a tirade. She portrayed herself as a stalwart defender of community values, a volunteer working tirelessly to maintain the serene and mature environment that Creekide Meadows residents expected and deserved. She claimed the 55-plus aspiration was well understood and that my parents were the disruptive element, attempting to flout the established character of the neighborhood by encouraging frequent visits from their non-compliant family member. She waved her copy of the CC Roops in the air, declaring it her sacred text. When Commissioner Davies asked her directly if the HOA had ever formally applied for or received HOPA certification from any state or federal agency, Agnes faltered for just a moment. "It is our documented intent," she insisted. "The CCRs clearly state our aspiration. We are operating in accordance with that intent. But do you have the certification, Miss Periwinkle? Yes or no?" Davies pressed. Agnes deflected. "We conduct ourselves as a 55-plus community. Our residents appreciate the peace and quiet." Another commissioner, a sharp woman named Ms. Evans, then asked, "Miss Periwinkle, Are you aware that enforcing age-based restrictions without proper HOA certification could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act, potentially exposing your HOA and its members to significant legal penalties? Agnes scoffed. We are simply upholding our community standards, which everyone agreed to when they bought their homes. She then made a fatal mistake. She looked directly at my father, who was sitting quietly in the gallery, and said with venom, "Some people, like Mr. Henderson, who should know better given his former profession, seem to think they are above the rules that govern everyone else." A gasp went through the room. Attacking a respected retired judge, even obliquely, in a public forum was incredibly poor form, and wildly irrelevant to the legal questions at hand. Commissioner Davies frowned deeply. "Miss Periwinkle," he said, his voice dangerously low, "Mr. Henderson's former profession is not under discussion here. What is under discussion is the legal basis for your HOA's actions, and frankly, your responses today have been evasive and unsatisfactory." He then addressed the HOA secretary, Mr. Peterson, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. "Mr. Peterson, as secretary of this HOA, are you aware of any formal HOA certification for Creekide Meadows?" Peterson stammered, "Well, no, not specifically a certification, sir, but Agnes, Miss Periwinkle, has always handled these matters." He trailed off miserably under Agnes's furious glare. The commission had heard enough. Commissioner Davies announced that based on the evidence presented and the testimony heard, the commission found sufficient grounds to refer the matter to the county attorney's office for a full investigation and a legal opinion on the status of the Creekide Meadows HOA and its enforcement practices. He also issued an interim directive. The Creekide Meadows HOA was to immediately cease and desist from enforcing any and all age-based restrictions on residency or visitation until the county attorney had completed their review and the commission had issued a final determination. My ban was, effectively, lifted, at least for now. Agnes Periwinkle looked thunderstruck. Her face, normally a mask of stern control, was contorted with disbelief and fury. She had come expecting to swat down a nuisance and reassert her dominance. Instead, her entire empire was now under official investigation, and her primary tool of control had been wrested from her grasp. She tried to speak, to protest, but Commissioner Davies cut her off with a sharp rap of his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The air crackled with the unspoken. Agnes Periwinkle had just met a power far greater than her own, the power of due process and actual law. And it was just the beginning of her unraveling. The county attorney's investigation was, by all accounts, thorough and swift. They had our meticulously compiled dossier as a starting point, and Ms. Albright provided them with any supplementary information they requested. They subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, meeting minutes for the past 5 years, and all correspondence related to the 55-plus policy. What they uncovered was even worse than we initially suspected. Moving beyond mere misrepresentation into areas of potential gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. It turned out Agnes Periwinkle and her compliant board hadn't just been aspirational about the 55-plus status. They had actively presented it as a done deal in informal communications with some realtors, though thankfully not my parents' realtor, to attract older buyers, yet had never taken any of the legally required steps to formalize it, nor had they maintained the necessary records or conducted the surveys. This selective misrepresentation was a serious issue. Furthermore, the financial records, once scrutinized by forensic accountants, revealed a pattern of questionable expenditures. HOA funds had been used for Agnes's personal vendettas, such as extensive mailings of warning letters about trivial violations that disproportionately targeted anyone who had ever questioned her. There were also significant sums paid to a landscaping consultant, who happened to be Agnes's nephew, for services that were either overpriced or, in some cases, never actually performed. The meeting minutes were, as suspected, heavily sanitized, with any dissenting opinions or challenging questions conveniently omitted. Mr. Agewws. Peterson, the HOA secretary, when interviewed by investigators, reportedly crumbled and confessed that Agnes essentially dictated everything, and the other board members were too intimidated or apathetic to challenge her. He even admitted to being pressured by Agnes to find violations against residents she disliked. The county attorney's office compiled a damning report, which was presented to the county commission about 2 months after the initial hearing. My father, Ms. Albright, and I attended the public session where the findings were discussed. Agnes Periwinkle was there too, looking considerably less confident than before. She even had an attorney with her this time, a harried-looking man who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation far better than his client. The report concluded that the Creekide Meadows HOA, under the leadership of Agnes Periwinkle, had 1. Systematically misrepresented its status as a HOPA-compliant 55-plus community without any legal basis. 2. Unlawfully enforced discriminatory rules based on this misrepresentation, in likely violation of the Fair Housing Act. 3. Engaged in financial mismanagement and demonstrated a severe lack of transparency and proper governance. 4. Breached its fiduciary duty to its members by failing to act in their best interests and by exposing the HOA to significant legal and financial liabilities. The county attorney recommended several actions. First, that the HOA be ordered to immediately and permanently cease all claims and enforcement related to being a 55-plus community until such time as it could legally and properly achieve that status through all required federal, state, and county procedures, which, given their track record, seemed unlikely. Second, that new elections for the HOA board be mandated and overseen by an independent third party appointed by the county to ensure fairness and remove the current entrenched leadership. Third, and this was the bombshell, the county attorney recommended that the commission consider petitioning the state to place the Creekide Meadows HOA into temporary receivership to untangle its finances, reform its governance, and ensure compliance with the law, due to the severity of the mismanagement and the board's demonstrated inability to govern lawfully. If the HOA couldn't be reformed even under receivership, dissolution was hinted at as an ultimate, albeit drastic, possibility. While not an outright ban from the county, in the sense of ceasing to exist immediately, it was a complete stripping of the current regime's power and a fundamental reset under county and state oversight. For Agnes Periwinkle, it was a public humiliation and the utter demolition of her authority. The commission voted unanimously to accept the county attorney's report and implement its recommendations. Agnes's attorney tried to argue for leniency, for a chance for the board to rectify these misunderstandings. But it was too little, too late. The evidence was overwhelming. Agnes herself sat in stony silence, her face pale. The directive for new, supervised elections was issued, effectively ousting her and her cronies. The process for appointing a temporary receiver began. My ban? It was ancient history, rendered utterly irrelevant by the collapse of the authority that had issued it. I could now visit my parents whenever I pleased, park in their driveway, and even bring my entire non-55-year-old toolbox without fear of invoking the wrath of Queen Agnes. The aftermath in Creekide Meadows was transformative. The fear that Agnes had cultivated began to dissipate. Residents started talking to each other more openly. When the supervised elections were held, a new slate of board members, reasonable, competent individuals who actually wanted to serve the community, not rule it, were voted in. My father, despite his initial reluctance to get involved beyond our personal issue, was persuaded by several neighbors to offer his expertise as an informal advisor to the new board as they navigated the transition and worked with the county-appointed receiver to clean up the mess Agnes had left. The receiver, a retired city manager with extensive experience in organizational turnarounds, worked with the new board to revise the CCRs, removing ambiguous and unenforceable clauses, streamlining procedures, and ensuring compliance with all applicable laws. The finances were put in order, and transparent accounting practices were implemented. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement of petty rules to genuine community enhancement. Agnes Periwinkle? She became a ghost in her own neighborhood. Stripped of her power, her public dressing down by the county, and the exposure of her mismanagement, she retreated into her home. Her reign of terror was over. The navy blue power suit was presumably retired. The clipboard, one imagines, gathered dust. Some neighbors said she eventually put her house up for sale, unable to bear living in a community she no longer controlled, where her pronouncements no longer carried any weight. Whether she found another kingdom to rule, I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. Her downfall was a direct consequence of her own arrogance and her relentless underestimation of those she sought to dominate. She picked a fight with the wrong family, one that had the knowledge, resources, and sheer stubborn determination to see it through not just to a personal victory, but to a systemic correction. My parents are much happier now in Creekide Meadows. It's become the peaceful, friendly neighborhood they'd hoped for. The lawns are still neat, and the mailboxes still match, but there's a lightness in the air that wasn't there before. The story of Agnes, and the great HOA upheaval, as some residents jokingly call it, has become a local legend, a cautionary tale about the abuse of petty power and the importance of vigilance. And my father? Well, he never explicitly banned the HOA from the county with a single judicial decree, but by meticulously using the system, by guiding us to expose their illicit foundation and egregious overreach, he effectively orchestrated a situation where the county had no choice but to step in and dismantle their rotten structure, purging the old guard and ensuring they could no longer operate outside the bounds of the law anywhere within its jurisdiction. It was a pro-revenge plot executed not with a bang, but with the relentless grinding gears of justice and bureaucracy, which, when properly engaged, can be far more devastating to a paper tiger than any explosion. So, if you're dealing with your own HOA nightmare, remember our story. Do your research, gather your evidence, understand the law, and don't be afraid to challenge illegitimate authority. Sometimes, the pen, backed by a thorough understanding of county ordinances and a well-argued legal petition, is mightier than the sword, or in this case, the clipboard. Thanks for listening to my crazy story, and don't forget to share your own HOA battles in the comments. It's always good to know you're not alone in the suburban trenches.